I've been shooting with the Sony A7CR for the past month or so, and it's safe to say I am loving this camera. So in this video, we're going to go over my settings that I've found that work best for photography in most everyday shooting scenarios. Yes, this is the A7CR, but the A7C II is almost completely identical in terms of software, so what works for one will work for the other. Before you do anything, make sure you change the auto power off temperature to high from standard. I believe the camera gives you the option to do this as soon as you turn it on and start setting it up. This video is mainly covering photography, but this is extremely important if you plan on shooting any video, because the last thing you want is for the camera to auto turn off if you're shooting any kind of wedding ceremony or an interview where you're away from the camera. So let's go over what I've found to be the best settings for this camera for photography. The first thing that I would recommend doing is configuring the main three dials on this camera. The rear dial I have set to shutter speed, because out of shutter speed, ISO, and aperture, my shutter speed is what I will be adjusting the most often. And the back dial is easiest to reach when your index finger is on the shutter button. The front dial I have set to aperture, and on the top dial, what is normally set to exposure compensation by default, I have set to my ISO. This was not an option on the original A7C, so it's a very welcome change because I always hated having to go into my menu system to change my ISO. With these three dials, once you have them set to the exposure triangle and after you nail in all of your autofocus settings that you want to use, you will be able to use this camera in a more analog feel, so you don't have to dig through menus, and it helps improve the overall shooting experience. The A7C II and the A7CR also allow you to use the touchscreen to adjust all of these settings, but personally I found that to be a lot slower and it's much faster to just use the three dials. I'm also not a big fan of touchscreens on cameras, so I just turned off the touchscreen completely. So this is what I recommend doing if you are shooting in manual mode. If you're shooting in an auto mode, I would highly recommend just using aperture priority. I would recommend setting your minimum shutter speed to about 1/125th or 1/250th of a second, and set your minimum ISO to 100 and your maximum ISO to either 1600 or 3200. That way you don't accidentally introduce too much grain into the image if you're shooting in low light scenarios. But when you are in aperture priority, make sure your ISO is set to auto, because otherwise your shutter speed will continue to drop below 1/125th, and that could introduce a lot more motion blur in your image than maybe you would want, as long as your subject is not moving too quickly. The next thing you need to do is configure your function menu to have all of the settings that you may need to adjust while you're out shooting on the fly. Because the last thing you want to happen is to be at a client shoot and be fumbling through the menu system because you can't find one specific thing. I have my drive mode set to single shot, my focus mode set to continuous autofocus, and my focus area set to expand spot. I'm a big fan of expand spot because it allows you to move your focus point around to a specific area with a little bit of flexibility. Because even with the AI autofocus in these cameras, I don't find the wide focus area to be as reliable as I would like for it to be. While these cameras do not have a joystick, it is still rather easy to move your focus point around with the scroll wheel on the back. The C2 trash can button will reset the focus point back to the middle of the screen, and the button in the middle of the scroll wheel will lock your focus point. Next up is the live view screen, which allows you to see your current exposure. I keep this on pretty much all of the time, but unless you are shooting with a flash, then you may want to turn this off. Next to that is my RAW file type. This is one of the only real differences between the A7C II and the A7CR. You have your normal uncompressed and compressed file types. Uncompressed being the largest file size, but providing you with the best possible image. While compressed will be much smaller in file size, you will sacrifice a little bit of dynamic range. The difference in dynamic range between the two file types is not astronomical, but especially on the A7CR, when you are working with a 61 megapixel sensor, you don't want to sacrifice any of your dynamic range. But if you don't want the massive file size, Sony also offers a lossless compressed RAW file. Lossless compressed will compress the RAW file, but when you import it into Lightroom, it will decompress the RAW file, which is very convenient for storage space, but also on your computer, because when working with compressed files, it will be a bit more taxing on your computer. So with lossless compressed, you kind of get the best of both worlds. So personally, that's what I would recommend using, and if you want to learn more, you can check out my previous video where I dive in a little bit deeper. On the bottom row, I have pixel shift, which is also only on the A7CR, which I haven't used yet, but perhaps it would make for an interesting video in the future. Next to that, I have my APS-C mode, just in case I want a little extra crop on my image. Next to that is my aspect ratio. I prefer personally to shoot in 4:3 instead of 3:2. I don't know why, I'm just not a big fan of 3:2 images. But when you're editing in Lightroom, you still have the full 3:2 RAW file. But with 4:3, it allows me to frame the images exactly how I want them while I'm actually shooting. It's also especially convenient if you're shooting with an Instagram crop in mind, because 4:3 is very similar to 4:5. Next up is silent mode, just in case I need to shoot quietly at a wedding or some kind of event. And for the last two, I have my white balance and the touchscreen operation, just in case I need to turn it on for whatever reason, but I don't think I will really need to. Next up is the C1 custom button, which is new to the A7C II and the A7CR. By default, it is set to white balance. I found that to be pretty convenient for white balance, but if you're shooting RAW files, you really don't need to worry about the white balance or ever adjust it. It's just nice if you want to give your photos a little extra spice while you're actually out shooting in the field. But if you're like me and you don't really plan on using this camera too much for video, you can change the record button here on top to act as a normal custom button as well. I have mine set to the main menu, which has most of the settings that I've mentioned so far in the function menu, but some additional ones as well. This main menu that Sony has added to their recent cameras is extremely convenient, and I feel like people don't talk about it enough. Sony has gotten a lot of flack over the years for their menu system, and while they have continued to improve it, this main menu system really simplifies the whole process. As I mentioned earlier, this video is not specifically going over video settings, but obviously you will need that record button if you're shooting video, so I would recommend just setting your C1 custom button back here to that main menu, because it offers even more options and it's even more useful when you are shooting video. And depending on the lens you have, your lens might have a custom button on the side. Most newer Sony lenses have at least one or two custom buttons. I did have mine set to the APS-C mode, but I quickly turned that off because I found myself often accidentally hitting that button or forgetting I had it on and ruining my images or affecting the resolution of my images. So I turned that off and I don't have anything set to that button currently. So if you've been following along and you've configured your camera like mine, I would recommend going into your settings and saving these settings as a preset, just in case you want to go back in and change some things and maybe find something that would possibly work better for you. And those are the photography settings that I've found to work best and really speed up my workflow for the A7CR and the A7C II. I was originally planning to cover both photo and video settings in this video, but it would have been a really long video. So I decided to split it up. So if you want to see a video covering all of the video settings and what I personally think would work best, then let me know in the comments down below. So I hope this video was able to help you out, or at least point you in the right direction. I have a lot of other videos on my channel about the A7CR and the A7C II and the original A7C that you can go check out. Some of them where I'm actually out shooting and using the camera. So if you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to help support me so I can continue growing and reaching a larger audience. And I hope I could inspire you guys to get out and take more photos. Go out and shoot.